There is a valley in southern Jordan where the mountains bleed red. Not the red of violence, not the red of fire. Something older. Something the earth itself decided millions of years ago to paint into its own skin. Iron oxide layered through sandstone in ribbons of crimson and salmon and rust, folded and compressed over epochs until the walls of the canyon look less like geology and more like something dreamed. If you walk into that valley today, and roughly 1 million people do every year, you will follow a narrow gorge called the Sikh. The walls close in around you, 80 meters high in places, so narrow that in some stretches you could touch both sides at once. The sky above becomes a thin, bright ribbon, and the air cools, and the light goes strange, filtering and bouncing between rock faces until everything glows with a color that has no proper name in English. You walk for over 1 kilometer through this gorge, and then the walls open just slightly, and through the gap you see it, a facade carved directly into the living rock, 40 meters tall, columns and capitals and pediments in a style that mixes Greek and Egyptian and something else entirely, something you cannot quite place because it belongs to a people whose aesthetic vocabulary has been mostly lost. The stone is the color of a desert sunset frozen in place. This is Al-Khazneh, the treasury, the locals call it, though it was never a treasury. It was almost certainly a royal tomb, and it is the front door of Petra, the city of a people called the Nabateans. Pause on that word for a moment. Nabateans. Say it out loud if you like. The odds are very high that you have never spoken it before.
And that fact, that sheer blankness, that void where recognition should be, is itself one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Because the Nabateans were not a minor footnote. They were not a tribe that flickered briefly and vanished. For roughly 500 years, from the 4th century BC to the 2nd century AD, they controlled a commercial empire that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean, from the Red Sea to Damascus. At their peak, they were, per capita, almost certainly the wealthiest people in the ancient world. Roman generals tried and failed to conquer them. Egyptian pharaohs negotiated with them as equals. Greek historians wrote about them with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. And then they were gone. Not destroyed in some dramatic conflagration, not wiped out by plague or invasion. They simply faded, absorbed, dissolved into the Roman Empire like salt into water, and the desert closed over their cities like a wound healing, and the sand filled their cisterns, and the trade routes shifted, and within a few centuries, the greatest merchant civilization of the ancient Near East became a ghost story told by Bedouin shepherds who grazed their flocks among ruins they could not explain. Petra itself, their capital, their crown jewel, a city that once held 30,000 people and welcomed caravans from India and China and sub-Saharan Africa, was lost to the Western world for over 1,000 years. Lost, an entire city carved into mountains, hidden in plain sight, known only to the local tribes who had no interest in telling outsiders about it.
It was not rediscovered until 1812 when a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as an Arab pilgrim, talked his way into the valley by claiming he wanted to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of Aaron, the brother of Moses, which local tradition placed on a mountaintop nearby. He walked through the Sikh. He saw the treasury, and he understood immediately that he was looking at something the modern world had completely forgotten. How does that happen? How does a civilization that rich, that powerful, that architecturally audacious, a civilization that literally carved its identity into cliff faces, disappear from human memory? The answer, I think, lies in something the Nabateans understood better than almost any people who have ever lived. Something that sounds like a contradiction, but is not. They understood the power of being invisible. To understand the Nabateans, you have to understand the desert. Not the romantic desert of Hollywood, endless photogenic dunes under a tangerine sky, a lone figure on a camel silhouetted against the horizon. The real desert, the Hisma, the Negev, the Wadi Rum, the vast, brutal, magnificent wasteland that stretches from southern Jordan through the Sinai and deep into the Arabian Peninsula. This is a landscape that actively tries to kill you. Temperatures in summer can exceed 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit. Rainfall in some areas averages less than 50 millimeters a year. The rock radiates stored heat long after sunset, so even the nights offer only partial relief. Water sources are separated by distances that can take days to cross. Navigation is treacherous. The terrain shifts, landmarks repeat, wadis branch and rebranch in patterns that confound even experienced travelers. Every ancient army that tried to cross this desert without local knowledge lost men. Some lost entire units. The Assyrians knew this. The Persians knew this.
The Greeks, when they arrived under Alexander's generals, learned it quickly and painfully. But the Nabateans did not merely survive in this desert. They thrived. They were originally nomads, pastoral herders who migrated with their flocks along routes dictated by the seasons and the sparse water sources. The earliest references to them appear in the late 4th century BC, when the generals of Alexander the Great, carving up his empire after his death, sent expeditions against a people living around the Dead Sea and the rock fortress of, the Greek sources call it, Petra, the rock. The first encounter is telling. Around 312 BC, one of Alexander's successor generals, Antigonus the One-Eyed, sent a force of 4,000 infantry and 600 cavalry under his officer Athenius to raid the Nabateans. Greek intelligence reported that the Nabateans had gathered for a great annual trade fair and that their camp would be full of frankincense, myrrh, and silver. Athenius attacked at night. The raid was initially successful. The Greeks seized spices, silver, and captives. But the Nabateans regrouped with astonishing speed. They pursued the Greeks into the desert, caught them in camp at dawn, and annihilated almost the entire force. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus records that only 50 cavalry escaped, and most of those were wounded. Antigonus tried again. He sent his own son, Demetrius, later called Demetrius the Besieger, one of the most capable military commanders of the age, with a larger army. Demetrius marched to the Nabatean stronghold, and the Nabateans did something unexpected. They did not fight. They sent envoys. They negotiated. They offered gifts. They pointed out, politely but firmly, that they lived in a desert where no Greek army could sustain itself, that they had no cities to besiege, no fields to burn, no fixed assets to seize. They were smoke. They were wind.
Demetrius could chase them for months and catch nothing but sunstroke and thirst. Demetrius, who was no fool, accepted their gifts and went home. And the Nabateans learned a lesson they would never forget. The desert itself was their greatest fortress, and invisibility was their greatest weapon. But invisibility is a strategy, not an identity. And the Nabateans were about to become something far more complex than desert raiders. The catalyst was incense.
To a modern person, incense is a pleasant accessory, a stick you light during yoga, a cone that makes your apartment smell like sandalwood. To the ancient world, it was one of the most valuable substances on earth, and the most prized varieties, frankincense and myrrh, came from exactly two places: the Dhofar region of what is now Oman and the highlands of what is now Yemen and Somalia. The demand was staggering. Every temple in Egypt burned incense daily, every Greek sanctuary, every Roman household altar. Frankincense was offered to the gods at births, weddings, funerals, festivals, triumphs, and daily household rituals. Myrrh was essential for embalming, for perfume. The Roman historian Pliny calculated that Arabia exported 1,600 tons of frankincense to Rome every single year, at prices that could rival gold by weight. And between the incense groves of southern Arabia and the temples and markets of the Mediterranean lay the desert, the Nabatean desert. You see the opportunity. The Nabateans did not grow frankincense. They did not consume it in vast quantities. What they did was control the routes by which it traveled. They became the middlemen of the ancient world's most lucrative commodity, and they did it not through military conquest, but through the one resource they had mastered better than anyone else alive: water. In a desert where rain falls rarely and unpredictably, where rivers do not exist, where the nearest permanent water source might be days away, the Nabateans built a hydraulic infrastructure so sophisticated that modern engineers study it with genuine admiration. They carved cisterns into solid rock, thousands of them scattered across the desert along their trade routes, many of them hidden, disguised, their locations known only to Nabatean caravan guides. Some of these cisterns were enormous, capable of holding hundreds of thousands of liters. They were fed by an intricate system of channels, dams, and aqueducts designed to capture every drop of the rare desert rainfall and funnel it into underground storage. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, noted with astonishment that the Nabateans had engineered their territory so thoroughly that they could cross deserts that were impassable to anyone else. An invading army would find no water. A Nabatean caravan would find it everywhere if they knew where to look. This was the key. This was the mechanism by which a nomadic people became fabulously wealthy. They did not need to conquer territory. They did not need walls or standing armies. They needed cisterns. They needed knowledge. They needed the desert to remain a labyrinth to everyone but themselves. Every caravan carrying frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, or precious metals from Arabia to the Mediterranean had to pass through Nabatean territory, and every caravan needed water, and the Nabateans controlled the water. Not through violence, though they could be violent when necessary, but through engineering and secrecy. You paid the Nabateans for safe passage. You paid for water. You paid for guides. You paid for the privilege of arriving alive at the other end of the desert.
And if you tried to go around them, if you tried to find your own route, dig your own wells, establish your own network, you died. Not because the Nabateans killed you necessarily, because the desert killed you, because you did not know where the water was. It was the most elegant monopoly in the ancient world. And it is at this point in the story, roughly the 1st century BC, when the Nabatean kingdom has reached its zenith of wealth and influence, that we must introduce the man through whose eyes we will see the rest of this tale. His name was Silaus. We know remarkably little about his early life. The
The Nabateans, true to form, left us almost no biographical records. But we know what he became. He became the chief minister, the vizier, the prime minister, the second most powerful man in the Nabatean kingdom, serving under King Obotus III. And he was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The Roman historian Josephus describes him as handsome and young, still in his prime when he entered the orbit of Roman power. Strabo encountered him in person and noted his intelligence and political acumen. He spoke Greek fluently, almost certainly spoke Latin, and obviously spoke Nabatean Arabic as his mother tongue. He was a man who moved between worlds, Arab and Greco-Roman, desert and city, tradition and innovation, with the fluid ease of someone who understood that identity, like water in the desert, could be channeled in any direction you needed. To understand Silaus, you need to understand the moment he inhabited. By the late 1st century BC, the Nabatean kingdom faced an existential challenge. It was no longer enough to be wealthy. Rome had arrived. Not at the gates, not yet, but Rome was everywhere. Rome had swallowed the eastern Mediterranean.
Pompey had reorganized the entire region in 63 BC. Cleopatra was maneuvering in Egypt. Herod sat on the throne of Judea as a Roman client king, and Rome's appetite was insatiable, its gravitational pull inescapable. Every kingdom within reach faced the same question. How do you survive next to a superpower that devours everything it touches? The Nabateans had a playbook for this, the same playbook they had used against Antigonus and Demetrius 2 centuries earlier. Do not fight, negotiate, offer gifts, be useful, be indispensable, be the people who make the trade flow, the people whose cooperation is more valuable than their conquest. And Silaus was the instrument of this policy. The first great test came around 26 or 25 BC, when the Roman Emperor Augustus, fresh from consolidating his grip on the entire Roman world, decided he wanted Arabia. Not Nabatea specifically, Arabia Felix, happy Arabia, blessed Arabia, the distant southern land where the frankincense grew. Augustus wanted to cut out the middlemen. He wanted Roman control of the source. He sent an army of 10,000 under his prefect of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, to march south through the Arabian Peninsula and conquer the incense kingdoms of Yemen. And he asked the Nabateans for help. King Obotus dispatched Silaus as the expedition's guide. Now, consider the position Silaus found himself in. Rome wanted to bypass the Nabatean monopoly. Rome wanted direct access to the incense trade. If Gallus succeeded, the Nabatean kingdom would lose its primary source of revenue. The entire economic model, the cisterns, the caravans, the middleman fees, all of it would become irrelevant overnight. But refusing Rome was not an option. You did not say no to Augustus. Kingdoms that said no to Augustus ceased to be kingdoms. So Silaus said yes. He provided 1,000 Nabatean soldiers. He offered his services as guide through the desert.
And then, if the Roman sources are to be believed, he proceeded to sabotage the entire expedition. Strabo, who was personally acquainted with Aelius Gallus and heard the story firsthand, writes that Silaus led the Roman army by the longest and most difficult routes, that he guided them away from water sources, that he directed them through terrain that exhausted their supplies and broke their formations, that 6 months of marching achieved almost nothing, that the army, decimated by heat, thirst, disease, and Silaus's misdirection, eventually straggled back to Egypt, having conquered nothing of lasting value. Gallus blamed Silaus, Strabo blamed Silaus,
Roman honor demanded a scapegoat, and Sylleus was perfectly shaped for the role. But think about it from the Nabatean perspective. Sylleus had achieved something almost miraculous. He had cooperated with Rome, technically. He had provided troops and guidance, technically. And the expedition had failed, catastrophically. The Nabatean trade monopoly survived intact. Roman ambitions in Arabia were quietly shelved. Augustus, occupied with 100 other frontiers, moved on. Sylleus had defeated a Roman army of 10,000 men without drawing a sword. He had used the desert itself as his weapon, the same weapon the Nabateans had always used: invisibility, misdirection, the knowledge that the land would do the killing for you if you simply guided your enemy into its jaws. It was, arguably, the most Nabatean victory in Nabatean history. But Sylleus was not merely a desert strategist. He was, in his own way, a man of immense personal ambition, and this is where his story takes a turn that feels almost novelistic. Sometime after the Arabian expedition, Sylleus traveled to Judea. There he met Salome, the sister of King Herod the Great. Not the Salome of the New Testament, the one with the dance and the severed head. A different Salome, Herod's sister.
A woman who was herself a formidable political operator in a court legendary for its paranoia and bloodshed. Sylleus and Salome wanted to marry. The political implications were enormous. A union between the Nabatean chief minister and the sister of the Judean king would have created a power block that reshaped the entire region. Herod understood this immediately, and he was terrified. Herod demanded that Sylleus convert to Judaism as a condition of the marriage. Sylleus refused. Josephus tells us that Sylleus said his own people would stone him if he accepted circumcision and Jewish dietary laws. The marriage fell through, but the damage was done. Herod and Sylleus became bitter enemies, and this personal animosity would eventually intertwine with geopolitics in a way that destroyed them both, or rather destroyed Sylleus, because Herod had the advantage of being Rome's favorite client king. The feud escalated. Border disputes between Nabatea and Judea flared into open conflict. Herod sent troops into Nabatean territory. Sylleus sailed to Rome to plead his case before Augustus personally. Imagine that scene. Sylleus of Petra, a man from the desert, from a culture that prized invisibility and discretion above all things, standing in the court of Augustus Caesar, in the marble heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, arguing his case in fluent Greek, deploying every tool of rhetoric and diplomacy that his cosmopolitan education had given him. And for a time, it worked. Augustus was furious with Herod for his unauthorized military actions. The emperor sent a blistering letter to Herod, informing him that he would henceforth be treated not as a friend of Rome, but as a subject. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Sylleus, the Nabatean vizier, the desert man, had outmaneuvered the king of Judea in the Roman court. But Sylleus had overplayed his hand. Back in Nabatea, King Obotus had died.
The throne passed to Aratus IV, who had not waited for Roman approval before crowning himself. Sylleus, who may have had designs on the throne himself, was suddenly politically exposed. Herod's allies in Rome began feeding Augustus a different narrative, that Sylleus had lied about the border conflict, that he had poisoned Obotus, that he was a treacherous schemer unworthy of Roman trust. Nicholas of Damascus, Herod's personal historian and advocate, one of the most skilled orators of the age, prosecuted the case against Sylleus before Augustus. The charges were devastating: fraud, murder, conspiracy. The sabotage of the Arabian expedition years earlier was dredged up again as evidence of Sylleus's fundamental untrustworthiness. Augustus turned. Sylleus was convicted, sentenced to death, executed in Rome, far from the red stone walls of Petra, far from the desert that had been his people's fortress for centuries. The man who had guided a Roman army to its doom in the Arabian sands died in a Roman prison. Sylleus's fall was, in miniature, a preview of what would happen to the Nabatean kingdom itself. Because the Nabatean strategy, be useful, be indispensable, be invisible, had a fatal flaw. It worked only as long as Rome needed a middleman, and Rome's patience with middlemen was never infinite. For another century after Sylleus's death, the Nabatean kingdom survived. It even flourished. Under Aretas IV, who ruled from roughly 9 BC to 40 AD, one of the longest reigns in the ancient Near East, Petra reached its architectural zenith. The great tombs were carved, the colonnaded street was built, the hydraulic system was expanded until the city, improbably, had fountains and gardens and swimming pools in the middle of a desert that received less than 15 centimeters of rain a year. Aretas IV was so prominent that he appears, briefly, in the New Testament.
In 2 Corinthians, Paul mentions that the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus to seize him, a detail that confirms the Nabatean kingdom's reach extended far to the north. But the forces that would undo the Nabateans were already in motion. The first was maritime. Sometime in the 1st century BC, Greek and Roman sailors discovered, or rather systematized, their knowledge of the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. These winds, blowing predictably southwest in summer and northeast in winter, allowed ships to sail directly from Egyptian Red Sea ports to India and back in a single season. This was catastrophic for the Nabateans. Suddenly, the overland incense route, the route the Nabateans had controlled for centuries, the route their entire economy was built around, had competition. Roman merchants could now ship goods from India, from Arabia, from East Africa, directly to Egyptian ports, bypassing the desert entirely. Bypassing the Nabatean cisterns, bypassing the Nabatean guides, bypassing the Nabatean fees. The shift was not instantaneous. Overland trade continued, but the balance had tilted. The Nabatean monopoly was no longer absolute, and a monopoly that is not absolute is, in the long run, no monopoly at all. The second force was Roman. In 106 AD, the Emperor Trajan, a man whose appetite for conquest was enormous even by Roman standards, formally annexed the Nabatean kingdom. There was no great battle, no dramatic siege. The last Nabatean king, Rabel II, had recently died, and Rome simply absorbed the territory, turned it into a Roman province called Arabia Petraea, installed a garrison, built a road, the Via Nova Trajiana, running from the Red Sea port of Isla to Bostra in Syria, a road whose remains you can still trace across the Jordanian desert today. And just like that, the Nabatean kingdom ceased to exist, not with a bang.
Not with a whimper even, with a bureaucratic memo. The Nabatean people did not vanish overnight. Petra continued to function as a Roman city for centuries. Nabatean craftsmen continued to carve. Nabatean farmers continued to tend their terraced fields. Nabatean priests continued to worship Dushara and Al-Uzza in the high places among the rocks. But the identity, the distinct, coherent Nabatean identity, began to blur. Latin replaced Greek as the language of administration. Roman gods merged with Nabatean ones. Dushara became associated with Dionysus. The temples were modified, Romanized, eventually Christianized.
By the 4th century, Petra was the seat of a Christian bishop. And then even the city began to die. A massive earthquake in 363 AD devastated Petra's water system, the very infrastructure that had made the city possible. Repairs were made, but the city never fully recovered. Trade had long since shifted to other routes. The population dwindled. By the 7th century, when the Islamic conquests swept through the region, Petra was already largely abandoned. The desert moved back in, sand filled the channels, rockfalls blocked the narrow Seek. The great facades stood in their silent valley, unseen by anyone but the Bedouin, who used the caves for shelter and the open tombs for goat pens, and who told stories about jinn, spirits who had carved the city in a single night. For 1,000 years, that was all Petra was, a ghost story. But I want to return to the question of invisibility, because the Nabatean disappearance from history is not merely a matter of earthquakes and shifting trade routes. It is a matter of deliberate choice. The Nabateans did not write histories. This is not because they were illiterate, far from it. They developed their own script, a cursive form of Aramaic that evolved over centuries into the Arabic script used by over 1 billion people today.
Let me say that again, because it deserves the same weight we gave the Phoenician alphabet in the previous episode. The Nabatean script is the direct ancestor of Arabic. Every Quran, every Arabic poem, every Arabic street sign and newspaper and text message in the modern world descends from the writing system of this desert kingdom that most people have never heard of. They were literate, they were educated, they engaged with Greek philosophy and Roman law and Egyptian astronomy. They were, by any measure, a sophisticated civilization, but they chose not to record themselves. They wrote on papyrus, which does not survive in most conditions. They wrote on leather, which rots. They did not commission great stone inscriptions proclaiming their victories as the Assyrians did, as the Egyptians did, as the Romans did. They did not produce historians to celebrate their kings, as the Greeks did. The result is that almost everything we know about the Nabateans comes from outsiders: Greek geographers, Roman historians, Jewish chroniclers, people who observed the Nabateans from the outside and wrote what they saw, or what they thought they saw, through the lens of their own cultures and their own biases. The Nabateans themselves are silent, and I think this was intentional. Remember, invisibility was their strategy. Secrecy was their competitive advantage. The locations of their cisterns, the routes through their desert, the mechanisms of their trade, these were proprietary information, the trade secrets of an entire civilization. Writing it down was a risk. Broadcasting your knowledge was a risk. Better to keep it in living memory, passed from guide to guide, from trader to trader, from father to son. It worked brilliantly for as long as the civilization endured. But it meant that when the civilization faded, the knowledge faded with it. There was no archive, no library, no Nabatean Herodotus to tell their story in their own words.
They are a civilization we must reconstruct from footprints, from water channels, from carved facades, from the brief and often dismissive mentions in the histories of their more literate neighbors. It is like trying to reconstruct a symphony from the echo. I want to take you to Petra now, not the Petra of the tourists, not the treasury glimpsed through the sick that graces 1,000 Instagram posts. The other Petra, the Petra that most visitors never see. Beyond the treasury, the valley opens into a vast natural amphitheater of rock. The main colonnaded street stretches before you, Roman era, paved, flanked by ruined columns and the remains of shops and markets. To your left, carved into the cliff face, is the theater, a semicircular auditorium cut directly from the sandstone, capable of seating several thousand people. Above and around it, the cliff face is honeycombed with tomb facades, dozens of them, hundreds of them, carved at every scale, from modest rectangular doorways to elaborate multi-story confections with pilasters and pediments and carved eagles. But if you are willing to climb, and the climbs are steep, the paths narrow, the drops vertiginous, you reach the places that the Nabateans considered most sacred, the high place of sacrifice. It sits atop a mountain, reached by a path cut into the rock that winds upward through increasingly dramatic scenery. At the summit, you find a flattened platform, artificially leveled, carved from the mountaintop itself. There are channels cut into the stone for the drainage of blood. There is a rectangular altar. There are the bases of stelae, standing stones that once represented Dushara, the chief Nabatean god, who was worshipped not as a human figure, but as a block of stone. An aniconic god, a god without a face. Stand there on the high place and look out over the valley.
The treasury is invisible from here, hidden in its narrow gorge far below. What you see instead is the vast sweep of the Nabatean sacred landscape. Mountains carved with tombs, valleys dotted with temples, the distant shimmer of the desert stretching to every horizon. And the silence. The silence is extraordinary. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of presence, the sense that you are standing in a place saturated with meaning, meaning that you cannot fully access because the people who created it chose not to explain themselves to you. The Nabateans worshipped their gods on mountaintops. They believed in high places, Barmat in the Semitic languages, a concept shared with the ancient Israelites and other peoples of the region. But while the Israelites were commanded to tear down the high places, the Nabateans elevated them. Their most sacred rituals happened in the open air, on the heights, under the desert sky, in full view of the sun and the stars. Dushara, lord of the Shara being the mountain range around Petra. Al-Uzza, the mighty one, a goddess associated with the morning star, with fertility, with the fierce protective power of the desert itself. Alat, another goddess associated with fate and the underworld. These gods were not represented as human figures, at least not originally. They were represented as stones, battles from the Semitic Beit El, house of God, sacred rocks. Blocks of basalt or sandstone, sometimes rough, sometimes carefully shaped, sometimes set into elaborate niches carved into cliff faces. To a Greek or Roman observer, this was baffling. Where were the statues? Where were the anthropomorphic gods with their human dramas and their human faces? The Nabateans seemed to Greco-Roman eyes primitive in their worship, a misreading that reveals more about Greco-Roman assumptions than about Nabatean theology.
Because the Nabatean religion was not primitive. It was, in its own way, sophisticated and deeply considered. The refusal to depict the gods in human form was not a failure of artistic skill. The Nabateans were perfectly capable of carving human figures and did so increasingly under Greco-Roman influence. It was a theological choice. The divine for the Nabateans was not reducible to human form. It was present in the rock itself, in the mountain, in the water that appeared miraculously in the desert, in the morning star that rose over the Red Canyon walls. The gods were everywhere, and therefore the gods needed no face. Let us talk about water one more time, because water is the thread that connects everything in the Nabatean story: their survival, their wealth, their religion, their engineering, their city. Petra receives, on average, about 15 centimeters of rainfall per year.
that is roughly 6 inches. For comparison, London receives about 60 centimeters, New York about 120. 15 centimeters is not enough to sustain a city of 30,000 people. It is not enough for fountains and gardens and pools. It is not enough by any conventional calculation for civilization at all. But the Nabateans did not accept conventional calculations. They built a system. Modern archaeologists have mapped over 200 cisterns within Petra and its immediate environs. Many are enormous, carved deep into the rock, plastered to prevent seepage, connected by channels that collected runoff from the surrounding mountains. When rain fell, and in this region rain comes in sudden, violent downpours that fill the wadis with flash floods, the Nabatean system captured it. Every drop, every trickle. Channels carved into cliff faces directed water into settling basins, where sediment was filtered out, and then into storage cisterns, where it was kept cool and clean by the surrounding rock.
But it went further than that. The Nabateans built a pipeline, a ceramic pipeline, terracotta sections fitted together and sealed with plaster that brought water from the spring of Ain Musa, several kilometers outside the city, through the narrow Sikh Gorge and into the heart of Petra. You can still see the channels carved into the walls of the Sikh today, running along both sides of the gorge at head height, sometimes covered with stone slabs to prevent evaporation. They built dams. At least one major dam blocked the mouth of the Sikh, diverting the flash floods that would otherwise have roared through the narrow gorge and destroyed everything in their path. The water was redirected through a tunnel carved through solid rock, a tunnel you can still walk through, into a secondary wadi where it could be safely collected. They built terraced agricultural fields, walled enclosures on hillsides where captured water was used to grow grapes, olives, figs, and grain. In the desert, they built what is essentially a complete urban water infrastructure: supply, distribution, drainage, flood control, carved from living rock in a place where no water infrastructure should be possible. This was not merely engineering. This was a statement. This was a civilization saying, we refuse to be limited by our environment. We will reshape the environment itself. We will make the desert bloom. And we will do it so thoroughly that visitors from the well-watered lands of the Mediterranean will walk through our city and marvel at our fountains, which they did. The Roman sources consistently express amazement at Petra's abundance of water. In the desert, in the middle of the desert. If the Phoenicians' great gift to the world was the alphabet, a technology for storing language, then the Nabateans' great gift was a technology for storing water.
Both were systems for capturing something ephemeral and preserving it. Both were infrastructure for survival. And both were so effective that they outlasted the civilizations that created them. I said earlier that the Nabatean script evolved into Arabic. Let me trace that lineage because it is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated chains of cultural transmission in human history. The Nabatean script descended from Aramaic, which itself descended from Phoenician. So there is a direct line from the Phoenician merchants we discussed in the last episode, through the scribes of the Aramean kingdoms, through the Nabatean traders, to the Arabic script. But the Nabatean script did something unique. It became progressively more cursive, more flowing, more connected, more adapted to rapid writing with a reed pen on papyrus. The letters began to join together, the forms simplified and abstracted, and over the centuries following the Nabatean kingdom's absorption into Rome, as the Nabatean people blended into the broader Arab population of the region, their script traveled with them. The earliest known inscription in a recognizable Arabic script, as opposed to Nabatean, was found at Jabal Ram in southern Jordan in the heart of former Nabatean territory and dates to the early 4th century AD. It is essentially late Nabatean in transition. The boundary between Nabatean and Arabic script is not a sharp line, but a gradient, a gradual evolution, like a language slowly changing accent over generations. By the 6th century, the Arabic script had reached the form in which it would be adopted for the Quran, and from there it spread across the entire Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, from the Sahara to Central Asia. The Nabateans had vanished, but their handwriting conquered half the world. There is one more thing I want to show you, one more aspect of the Nabatean genius that deserves to be seen.
About 50 kilometers north of Petra, in the desert of what is now southern Jordan, lie the ruins of a Nabatean town called Avdat, or Obada, named after the deified king Obadas I. It sits on a hilltop overlooking the Negev, and it was, in Nabatean times, a major way station on the incense route. But what makes Avdat extraordinary is not the ruins on the hill, it is the farms in the valleys below. The Nabateans developed a system of desert agriculture that archaeologists call runoff farming. They did not irrigate from rivers or wells, there were none. Instead, they shaped the hillsides above their farms into smooth, cleared surfaces that acted as catchment areas. When rain fell on these prepared hillsides, it ran off quickly, much more quickly than it would off natural rough terrain, and was channeled through a system of small dams and diversion walls into terraced fields below. The ratio was roughly 30-to-1. For every unit of farmland, 30 units of hillside were prepared as catchment. The result was that each farm effectively received 30 times the natural rainfall. In a region with 100 millimeters of rain per year, the farms received the equivalent of 3,000 millimeters, more than London, more than New York. In 1959, an Israeli archaeologist named Mikhail Ivenery rebuilt one of these ancient Nabatean farms using the original techniques. He restored the hillside catchments, cleared the channels, rebuilt the terrace walls. And the farm worked. It produced crops. In the middle of the Negev desert, using a 2,000-year-old Nabatean design, he grew wheat, barley, peaches, almonds, pistachios, and apricots. The system still works. 2,000 years later, the Nabatean engineering still works. Think about that. Think about the civilizations we have discussed, the empires that rose and fell, the armies that conquered and crumbled, the cities that were built and burned.
The Nabateans built farms in the desert, and the farms still work. That is immortality of a kind that no pharaoh's tomb can match. So what happened to them? Where did they go? The answer is nowhere and everywhere. The Nabateans did not die. They did not flee. They were not massacred or exiled. They were absorbed. They became Roman provincials, and then Byzantine Christians, and then, in all likelihood, Arab Muslims. The population of southern Jordan and the Negev today almost certainly carries Nabatean blood. The Bedouin tribes who have lived in and around Petra for centuries are, in some sense, the Nabateans' descendants. But the identity is gone. The name is gone. The language is gone, absorbed into Arabic. The religion is gone, absorbed first into Greco-Roman syncretism, then into Christianity, then into Islam. The trade routes are gone, replaced by maritime shipping, then by railroads, then by highways and airports. All that remains is the stone, the facades at Petra, the cisterns in the desert, the channels carved into cliff faces, the high places on the mountaintops, the script that became Arabic. And there is a profound lesson in this, a lesson about the nature of civilization itself. The Nabateans remind us that a civilization does not need to be loud to be great. It does not need pyramids or colosseums or terracotta armies. It does not need to proclaim its greatness in stone inscriptions 10 meters high. It can be quiet. It can be invisible. It can do its work in the silent places, in the hidden cistern, in the cursive stroke of a pen, in the careful shaping of a hillside to catch the rain. The Nabateans built their world on water and silence, and both, in their different ways, have lasted. Silaus never saw the end of his kingdom.
He died in Rome, decades before the annexation, executed for crimes that may or may not have been real, a victim of the geopolitical game he had played so brilliantly and so recklessly. But I wonder, sometimes, if he understood what was coming. He had stood in the court of Augustus. He had seen the machinery of empire up close. He had felt its weight, its inevitability, its patient, grinding hunger for territory and control. He must have known, must have sensed at least, that the desert strategy had an expiration date, that invisibility works only until someone builds a road through your territory, that monopoly works only until someone finds a sea route around your desert. Did he lie awake in his Roman cell in the nights before his execution and think about Petra, about the red canyon walls and the sound of water running through channels carved into stone, about the high place of sacrifice at dawn when the desert light turns everything to gold? We will never know. He left no memoir, no last testament, no final inscription. He was a Nabatean to the end, invisible. Petra stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the new 7 wonders of the world. 1 million visitors a year walk through the Sikh and gasp at the treasury. Tour guides recite facts about Hellenistic architecture and Roman columns. Tourists take selfies and buy postcards and ride camels past facades carved by a people whose name they will forget before they reach their hotel. And that is fine. That is how tourism works. The experience is genuine, even if the understanding is shallow. But if you go, if you ever find yourself in that red valley, I would ask you to do one thing: climb to the high place. It takes about 45 minutes, and the path is steep, and you will be out of breath, and the sun will be fierce. But climb. And when you reach the top, stand on the flattened stone and look out over the valley. Look at the mountains riddled with tombs. Look at the desert stretching to the horizon. Listen to the silence. And remember that the people who carved this place into existence chose to tell you nothing about themselves. Remember that the water system beneath your feet, invisible, underground, carved into the rock's hidden veins, was more important than the facades above. Remember that the script they developed with their reed pens on their perishable papyrus outlasted every monument they carved. Remember that they controlled the ancient world's most valuable trade route, not through conquest, but through knowledge. Remember that they turned a desert into a garden. And remember Silaus, brilliant, doomed, walking the marble halls of Rome with cowrie shells at his throat and desert dust in the seams of his sandals, playing the most dangerous game in the ancient world and losing and vanishing into the silence that his people had always preferred. The Nabateans are gone, but the stone remembers. The water remembers. And now, perhaps, so do you.